Let me try and set the scene for you before getting into the nuts and bolts of this one. 4 generations of Toyota Supra were sold in the United States. This is the third. Yes, the Mark III Supra ran from 1986 and a half to 1992. This was the first Supra that wasn't a Celica Supra. It was in no way related to the Toyota Celica. When this car came out, at the same time came a new Celica on a totally separate front-wheel drive platform. But during the first and second generations of the Supra before this car, it was a version of the Celica. But it was more than just a trim package. Everything forward of the firewall was different, elongated by a factor of 1.5. The hood, elongated by a factor of about 1.5. The engine, elongated by a factor of exactly 1.5. Yes, that was the point of the Celica Supra. Its special straight six made it a very different car than the plain old Celica. Now, I don't believe that the Mark IV Supra that succeeded this car needs much of an introduction. It's one of the most beloved, cherished sports cars of all time. Today, any 4th generation Supra that you find for sale in halfway decent shape will still fetch a sale price similar to what it sold for brand new in the 90s, maybe even more, and they were expensive. Truly remarkable cars that have stood the test of time. But the 3rd generation Supra was an inflection point. This was the heaviest Supra Toyota ever sold, bookended by both a significantly lighter predecessor and successor. With ties to the Celica cut and its formerly humbler roots no longer holding the Supra back, in its 3rd generation it ballooned into a big, thirsty, heavy, disco-era shrine to the excess that defined the 80s, dripping with power and testosterone. From the outside, this car certainly looks the part of a late 80s sports car, pop-up headlights and all. The design is post-boxy, but pre-round. You could call it pointy. It is a hatchback, and there's no shortage of glass here. Toyota loaded this car up with power everything, automatic everything. After all, they were asking good money for these, and being 80s, 90s Toyotas, none of those power accessories will ever fail on you. You got 2 engine options, a naturally aspirated 7MGE or a single turbo 7MGTE. The 7M was the final engine born from Toyota's strokier M family before the introduction of the JZ engines. This differed from the 5M offered in the Mark II Supra in 2 ways. It was 3 liters as opposed to 2.8, and it had 4 valves per cylinder as opposed to 2. The turbo car came with a beefier R154 transmission, and turbo lag is present. After all, this is 30-year-old technology. The Turbo 7M in this car is sweetest from about 3,000 RPMs up. It really takes off. So how do you place this car? Was it a pony car? Competitor, that is. Well, it was more sophisticated than a pony car. The engine's sublime smoothness and linearity gave it a quality of power delivery that you did not get in a pony car. The sophisticated, however goofy, suspension meant that this car cornered better. It was better connected to the road than a Mustang or Camaro. How connected? Well, this is still a big heavy car, so you didn't have the tossability of a small sports car like, say, an RX-7, and unlike, say, Toyota's own MR2, not only was this car front-engined, it was a straight 6, and the geometry of an inline engine tends to push weight even further forward on a car's nose. Not ideal for handling, but I personally do like the power quality of an inline 6, so that's the compromise you make with this car. Bottom line, the best comparison for the Mark III Supra may be a C4 Corvette. How's the driving experience? Well, the interior is very pleasant, especially for an 80s sports car. It's comfortable, it's tightly built, it's pleasing to the sight and touch. That may be the single biggest difference between this car and the aforementioned Vet. Would you take a look at that gauge cluster? Heck, the entire dash. Close to perfection in my opinion. The same could be said for these well-bolstered, highly adjustable seats. Engine, awesome. Transmission, awesome. The chassis is the Supra's weak spot. This car never lets its driver forget just how much weight is placed fore of the firewall. The body is, largely due to the optional target top and standard hatchback configuration, not as stiff as it ought to be. This particular car's suspension is tuned aggressively. It's very firm because the car's previous owner did race it. So this perfect storm of weight, lack of rigidity, and rock-crushing suspension means that this car is not an ideal daily driver. Road imperfections hit hard, causing the car to buck. The front suspension geometry is downright weird, not really in a good way, so bumps in the road tend to upset the steering. The car doesn't have a tossable feel because there's just always a lot of weight moving around that has to be accounted for. For lack of a better description, what this car lacks is that crisp, connected feel we associate with BMWs from the good old days. However, once it settles into a turn, it does hold the road quite well. So here's my verdict on the Mark III Supra. With its turbo engine and stiff suspension, this car might be the Supra you want to race, but deep down, I think that the Mark III really wants to be a GT car, a tourer. So if I were going to build one from the ground up, I'd keep the suspension soft, as is fitting for a 3,700-pound car. As a natural aspiration purist, I'd skip the turbo engine for the solid, unquestionable linear power of a naturally aspirated 7M, and I'd skip the target top in favor of a standard roof in order to gain some body stiffness. I'd like to say that there's a spectrum with sports cars, that you have heavier, faster cars on one end and wimpier but better handling cars on the other. But that would imply a binary state. In reality, there are a lot of variables at play, and it's more complicated than that. However, just as we distill the unsolvable problems of physics down to flawed but informative approximations, so too can we create a measuring stick that explains our situation here. There's a line. A Toyota 86, a Mazda Miata, and even a Mark IV Supra are on one side of that line. A Ford Mustang, a Hyundai Genesis, and a Chevrolet Camaro are on the other side of that line. The key variable here is weight. If you're looking for tossability and sharp connected handling, then you'll find that this Supra is on the wrong side of the line. But if you want a meaty, powerful sports car with a more sophisticated powertrain and better build quality than some of the usual suspects, then you've got it. And that's how the Mark III Supra earned its nickname. The best Corvette Japan ever built.